Some of the things that we're going to be attacking today in our learning is going to be lines, boundary, shape, and space. Now, we're going to focus mostly on lines and shape and boundaries, and we'll start to touch on space a little bit. We will not be discussing very in-depth shading today, just a little discussion of that. All right, so stay tuned if you want to learn about how lines work and the reasons we use them and how to communicate more effectively when you're doing your drawing. So, the first thing we're going to discuss today is lines. Lines come in a couple different variations. We have vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal, combination lines, and curved lines. Now, is that the all-inclusive lineless? No, it is not. There's a lot more lines out there. Take it from me. But these are the kind of grandfather and grandmother, kind of old relative type of lines that all the other lines kind of come from. Okay? So we're going to learn about those. Now, the first type of lines, vertical lines, which are lines that go straight up and down. Those lines are thought of as stable. And when I say stable, I mean they feel mentally comfortable. You don't feel like they're going to change up on you. Okay? So we've kind of divided our lines into stable or dynamic. Okay? Now, dynamic means movement, change, energy, difference from one thing to the other. Okay? So it's kind of a sense of excitement, whereas stability, feeling stable, feels same, repetitive, or not necessarily repetitive, but feeling of flatness, relaxedness, calmness, dependability is a good one. That's a good word. So, vertical, of course, up and down lines remind us of up and down, looking up and down. They remind us of lifting, so something coming from the floor up like an elevator. They can remind us of being strong, okay? Something that's strong like a pillar can support weight. Tall. They literally make us feel like we're looking at something that's tall. Height, that makes you think of height. Now, tall and height are a little bit different. Tall is kind of a descriptive word for feeling, and height is more about a measurement, okay? So we relate those things to vertical lines as well. Plunge, okay, that's a feeling, more of a feeling kind of word, adjective, where we feel like we're going downward quickly, okay? Positive and negative, okay? So that means good feelings, good associations, negative associations, and it's also linked to spirituality, which could be heaven, hell, good, bad, good, evil, whatever you want to think of it. So some good examples of some lines that are vertical, you will see a lot of vertical lines in trees, right? A lot of trees are very tall and they make us look up, right? So a lot of the lines that we're going to learn about today, and a lot of things in general in art, are mimicries of nature, okay? And since we all kind of share the universal language of nature, we can learn a lot that way by just paying attention to nature and using that to communicate. So in art, we have translated that into almost like a language that you can use to effectively draw or design, okay? So if we move on here, and we think about these stable lines, and we think about the different type of traits it has, if we think about the possibility of positive, negative, heaven, hell, things like that, that's why a lot of cathedrals around the world or places of worship will be very tall, and you'll see a lot of arches in them. So that is because when you're looking at the line of the wall in the doorway, you look at about eye level, and then you look up, and then you come back down again. So that very tall line plus the arc, and then coming back down as a vertical line, makes us feel and think about up and down, and our relationship to it. So vertical lines are about our relationship to being strong or weak, tall or short, stable or unstable, and in this case, stable. Okay, moving on, horizontal lines. Horizontal lines are kind of a little bit of the opposite, but at the same time the same, which is kind of confusing, right? Yeah, it kind of sounds confusing. They're stable because they're dependable. Lines that don't have a lot of change to them or energy feel stable, especially lines that go straight up and down or sideways, okay, horizontal lines. Mostly that stability comes from the mimic of nature in the horizon line, When you look out your window, your horizon line into the distance is always flat. Even though we're on a curved Earth, from our point of view at any fixed point, unless we're close to the stratosphere, everything's going to seem flat in our horizon line. And that is dependable. We can look out our window any day of the week and go, oh, there's the horizon. Ah, yep, good old dependable Earth, still being flat on the horizon line there. Okay? So, this sideways kind of feeling also has some other connotations. Okay? Feeling of laying, okay, of restfulness when you're sleeping, okay, and we relate that to laying flat while we're resting. A feeling of forever. Horizontal lines have a feeling of forever because depending on how we view them, we view the horizon as kind of unending. You can't find the end of the horizon, okay. Water, okay, still water, flatness, the calmness of water. And then also gentle, has a feeling of gentleness, okay? But once again, it's stable. It feels stable. And stable meaning dependable and non-changeable, okay, in this context. So those two lines are dependable and stable. That's why a lot of our language has a lot of straight and horizontal lines in it, because it's easy for our brain to interpret very quickly, okay? Diagonal lines. Diagonal lines are a little bit different. Those are called dynamic lines, and they are from side to side. Okay, they don't have to be from a corner to a corner in anything, but they are angular, so they are not this way or this way. They're somewhere in between. Okay, so they have a feeling of falling. They have a feeling of movement, of zooming, of direction. Okay, and of course they have a feeling of actually being diagonal. Now these lines are a little bit interesting because they're an easy way for us to add excitement into our artwork. When you add in angular lines, what you're doing, it leads the eye around like a zigzaggy snake. And that's an easy way to create kind of interest in your artwork and your drawings. Okay? But it's also a little bit more than that. The feeling of dynamic lines also gives us a slight sense of danger. And because our brain is always on the prowl for possibilities of danger, it's one of the first lines it notices. So it will pay attention first, hierarchy-wise, to diagonal lines before it pays attention to vertical and horizontal lines. Because think of nature. If you were out in a storm and you have two trees, one tree being falling sideways like this and one tree straight up, and you needed to go and get under a tree to get out of the rain, are you going to go to the one that's straight up with branches going like this, or the one that's like this at an angle? You're probably going to go to the straight one, right? Because you're afraid if you go under that tree, it's going to fall. Okay, so our brain's always aware, in a small sense, of danger, and it also finds that slightly exciting at the same time. So even if it doesn't say, oh, dangerous, it says, ooh, exciting, and it pays attention to diagonal lines. Then we have combination lines. Combination lines are 1, 2, 3, these three lines together, which is vertical lines, horizontal, and diagonal. Okay, so you have the strength of up and down, the calmness of stability, and then you have a diagonal line that comes at you like this. And then that creates perspective. See the foreshortening in my hand? So I have this line here, this line there, and then if I come down towards you like this, that becomes perspective, okay? So diagonal lines added to horizontal and vertical lines create depth instead of a feeling of flatness, okay? And those are very stable. Because there's a feeling of three-dimension, it feels like something that can be self-supportive, okay? And even though there's a box up here as an example, combination lines come in a lot of different varieties, okay? And a lot of combination lines we see when we draw, we think of them slightly different, okay? And I'm going to explain. These last two are kind of, I guess you could say, opposites in a way. Combination lines like this that are very angular and attached together with diagonal, horizontal, and diagonal, horizontal, and vertical lines give us a feeling of that perspective, but they also give us a feeling of being kind of man-made. So thinking of buildings, thinking of an air conditioner unit hanging out of a building, thinking of a desk or a chair you sit in, all those things, thinking of a street that comes out at you, and you have two diagonal lines going this way, right? You have the sides that are straight on the rails, okay? Those lines all add up to feeling of depth, okay? And they're very dynamic, very dynamic. Even though it's stable, it's a little tricky, even though it's stable, that dynamic view comes from the diagonal lines like we talked about, okay? Now, the other end of the spectrum here are curved lines. Those are the most dynamic lines of all. Curved lines have a feeling of movement, okay? The reason is that the spiral of a galaxy, the spiral of a seashell, the crash of a wave as it spirals, all these kind of spiral and gentle curvatures that we find in nature have energy. They are in the middle of being energetic. And even our spine, which has a slight curve in it, right, is there because it allows us to create energy when we move, okay? So that's a potential energy, potential meaning it has the ability to create motion, okay? And we think of motion as very dynamic. That's one of the most dynamic things we can think of, right? So it's organic, it has a feeling of flowing, it has a feeling from nature of movement, of spiral, okay? So this is very man-made, and this is very from nature, okay? And then we're going to move on and we're going to discuss these shapes over here. So next we're going to discuss these different shapes, okay? A shape is a line that closes up, okay? And it doesn't have to be these shapes up here, but these are kind of the general shapes that we see a lot when we draw, okay? And as artists, those are some of the shapes that when we're starting to shade, we practice a lot. And then we move on to still lives and then portraiture and all these different things, okay? But these lines help us find boundaries, and they help us find the internal shapes within something that we're drawing so that we can find the whole shape of the entire object, okay? So kind of like a forest, you have to be able to see certain trees to appreciate the whole forest. So this is going to teach you to understand the trees so you can make the forest, okay? So sit tight, hold on, and we will get to drawing soon, but this lecture is very important so you understand what it is you're drawing, and if you make a mistake, oh hey, now I kind of see why I made a mistake and how to fix it. And by the way, mistakes are very good in art. Don't let anybody tell you differently. You learn through mistakes in art. In fact, when you're first starting art, I hope that you make lots of mistakes, and I mean that in a very genuine way, because you will learn very quickly, and you just got to throw out the idea of, ooh, a mistake equals bad. It does not equal bad. It equals progress, okay? So here we have a rectangle, okay? These are 2D shapes. We have a triangle, we have a circle, and we have a square. What's the difference between these, you're asking? Sometimes people get confused with shapes, right? A rectangle has longer sides and then shorter sides like this. So it is elongated. It's an elongated box. It's stretched out, okay? And then you have a triangle, which is 3 points and 3 lines, 1, 2, 3, okay? And triangles come in different variations and different lengths. But in general, we're going to focus on just a simple triangle like this. And I think, if I remember correctly, don't quote me, it's an isosceles. I might be wrong. And here is a circle, okay? Circle is an arc, 2 arcs, or a single line that is formed into one long continuous line that goes around, okay? When a circle starts to get smushed like this, we call it an ellipses, all right? And we will see a lot of those too. Not too often do you see a perfect circle when you're drawing something. We see variations of circles kind of smushed or elongated and all kind of morphs of circles and spheres later on. And then the last one is a box, okay? And, or I'm sorry, yes, a box. And those are your 2D shapes, okay? A box is same on all 4 sides. And those turn into some of our 3D shapes here. Now the 3D shapes is what we're going to see a lot when we start to sketch and do shading, because we have to be aware of 3D shapes. But first, before we get too deep into that today, we're going to discuss how to find these shapes first. But just a little bit so you can marinate it in your brain, let's talk about these for just a minute. This rectangle can morph into a tall rectangular box. You have your vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines. Or from the side, remember we're looking at it flat from the side, it can also turn into a cylinder, okay? Which is a circle on the top and the bottom and a tube that goes up and closes itself, right? Now the triangle can turn into a cone, which is a smooth surface all the way around, which is rotated, like so, with a pointy top and a round bottom, right? It can also turn into something that's kind of like a polygon, that has sides on it like this, or we can think of it as a pyramid, okay, where we have a bunch of different sides like this, like the Great Pyramids in Giza, okay? Then a circle turns into a sphere. A sphere is just a ball that comes out to you 3D shape. Instead of being flat like this, it has shape, okay? And as we talked about before, a sphere can also morph into all these strange egg shapes and smushed shapes and kind of globular shapes, okay? And those are all variations of a sphere to begin with. And our last one here is a box, okay? Or a cube. A box turns into a cube, a square turns into a cube, okay? But from the side, it may also be a cylinder, okay? Depending on how you draw it or if you transform it, because that length can look the same on both sides like this until you rotate it and you see a circle there, okay? And the last one here that we don't think of very often or get taught very often is a plane. Now, a plane is a connecting surface between different shapes when we're drawing. When we're not talking about it mathematically, I don't do math, you gotta go to somebody else for that, okay? But a plane here, that is gonna be a flat area that merges from one area to the next. So it's kind of like the glue between shapes. So we keep our eye out for planes a lot. We see a lot of those, okay? Now I'm going to circle the shapes for you that you see the most. The ones you tend to see the most are going to be, and the 3D ones, you see these, okay, 3D and 2D. You see a lot of these, but a whole lot of these, ton of those, okay? A lot of these, a decent amount of these. Not very often do you see anything when you're drawing, unless it's man-made, like we talked about before, that has a lot of angles on it. Mechanical, man-made things are very angular. Okay, down at the molecular level, that's a little bit different and stuff. We're not getting down into chemistry and biochemistry and all that stuff. You know, nature can get very technically angular at a certain point, but we're not drawing that. We're just seeing what's actually there. We're not going under a microscope, okay? That's not this class. But you can see here, angular, 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 okay? So we're not really doing the angular ones. We're not too interested in those. They may show up from time to time, but not a ton. Even this guy, he'll show up once in a while. He's really just a small version of that fella, okay? So next I'm going to show you how to start sketching and finding some different things. And we're going to start with our very own hands at home, okay? So now that we've talked about shapes and we've talked about their 2D and 3D versions, you have received a worksheet in each one of your kits for this workshop. If you are watching this as a person who did not originally participate in the workshop, you can make yourself a sheet similar to this. You can take a screenshot of it and then simply print it out from your printer at home. Using a Control-Alt screen print button set, or whatever set you have set up at home, will allow you to screen capture this from the video if you stop it at this point right now. Okay, so for those of you who do have all this stuff and you're part of the workshop in the learning series, let me explain exactly what's going on here. So remember how we talked about we weren't going to do a lot of shading? Well, we're not. We're not necessarily going to go in shading, but we have to learn how to identify three-dimensional shapes in order to find them and map them in our drawings as two-dimensional shapes, especially if you're going to start cartooning. A lot of times for people, it's very difficult for them to figure out where that kind of stops. So what we're going to do here is we're going to identify these shapes in a hand. If you take a look at your own hand, yours is going to be a lot different than mine. I have shorter hands. They're slightly chubby, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and try to hold it in a very similar position. Let me see if I can find it to right about there. And if I turn it sideways, you can see a little bit better. Okay, so something similar to that. Now, if you look at the hand, you can see that to the side here, the shade by numbers area, I've mapped out the different parts of my hand. So everybody's hand's slightly different. okay? Yours may be thicker or thinner. You might have nice nail polish. Mine doesn't. Point being, though, is that these different shapes are something we can relate to easily. Leonardo da Vinci said, if you can draw a hand, you can draw anything. Okay? So a lot of times when I teach art classes, I make sure people start with their hands first, because you always have your hand on you. Okay? At least most people do. Some people don't have that. But if you don't use your hand, you can always use a foot, or you can use someone's face. Okay? So as you have this here, you can see the different shapes as I manipulate like this. And you can start to see that in my fingers right here, look at that shape right there, kind of looks a little bit like a ball, right there. And if you go over here into the map, you see 1, 1, 3, 3. Up here it says 1, 2, 3. If you go over and you see how this is shaded like that, in my finger, the light's slightly different from where I'm at. It's right that way instead of directly over. But you can see how that kind of looks like the ball shape there a little bit. How it's kind of roundish. It gets darker towards the bottom. And it is staying dark towards the bottom because I don't have a reflective surface like the ball does here to reflect back. If I did, it would look slightly different, and let me show you. Whoops. With my hand here, like we talked about, if I come over and I bring just a white piece of paper underneath, the reflective quality of the light now makes it reflected underneath. If I take that away, that's what happens. And I'm doing nothing but giving a surface that's close by. So whenever you have a sphere and you've identified it in a shape somewhere, first off, look to see where your light is coming from. The brightest part of your sphere will point back to the brightest light source in your room. So for me, I have multiple light sources going on. You're not always going to have one, which is good for learning when you're first learning. But what you want to do is identify the brightest part. So looking at my hands here, you can see this is kind of a ball shape. The tips of my fingers are ball shapes, right? Okay, and this over here is kind of a flattened ball. Okay, your fingernails are curved. And if you look at my fingernail shininess and look at the sphere. Okay, if you look down here and you see the cylinder, you see the cylinder and you see the cone, you can also start to identify that. If you think of the finger as a single shape and turn it this way, it gets thick to thin. Now, my fingers are different shapes than yours, and some are very chunky at the bottom and thin at the top, or thin all the way up. And all it does is help you kind of identify a shape. Now, what's a little tricky about art is the shape that you find in my hand and what I may find in my hand may be slightly different. As long as you are capturing the gist of the hand, usually you're communicating effectively when you're drawing. However, if you want to communicate exact reality, you want to get really good at identifying the most potent, best identifiable universal shapes you can find in the hand. And that's why, or anything you're drawing, that's why we really stick with these ones in particular when we're first learning to draw things that are especially organic. Now remember, like we talked about before, we still have the other shapes that are out there, and I've marked with happy faces, the shapes that we use more often in organic shapes, things like hands, but there's the other shapes as well, like the man-made shapes. Things that we see that combine those combination lines. We're not going to see a whole lot of that today. So what we're going to do here is we are going to start to map out a hand. And we're going to do this live here as opposed to the worksheet you have here. The worksheet you have here is going to be for identifying your shapes and then starting to gently kind of shade in those areas. And we haven't talked a lot about shading, but it's not so much about trying to make it look realistic as it is identifying the shapes that are there so that you can really kind of map them. Okay, so for this next part, I'm going to show you a little bit how to kind of shade this area in. And once again, we're not really attacking shade very vigorously today. Please remember that while we're doing this. You don't have to be perfect at this. Remember, throw perfect out the window. That's a bunch of baloney. There's no such thing as perfect in art. So I'm looking over here, and this is a cylinder. So if I turn it sideways, this one here, if we were to complete, it's called completing the circuit. It means stopping. When you have a stopped line like this, it means you complete the line like this to close it up. Now you only do this when you're sketching to kind of help you figure stuff out. If we look over here, this one kind of looks like it's going to be a cylinder, but then it gets rounded at the end. So we have to treat it a little bit like a cylinder and a little bit like a sphere, okay? And then if we come over here, this one here where the skin folds looks a little bit like a sphere, a little bit like a sphere, sphere. This one here, kind of a cylinder, kind of a cylinder. I suppose you could treat this one like a sphere. It looks spherical, but when I looked at it shading-wise, it felt more flat in the side, which makes sense because these other fingers are also cylinders. This big area right here is kind of a cylinder, okay? But I know in my mind, the knuckle is here in my hand, so I'm actually gonna erase the number 3 just for now. Oh, I can't, this is a copy. I forgot. Well, we'll just play along here, that there's gonna be kind of a circular shape. And then we have a sphere down here, sphere here, sphere here, and this is gonna be kind of a cone, or I'm sorry, a cylinder shape, this one right here, a cylinder shape through here. So you have a number 2 pencil that has been sharpened, maybe a couple of them in your kit, as well as a good old pink eraser. People hate on these pink erasers, but you know what's great about them? You can cut them any shape you want. So when you're trying to get in little fine areas to erase, or you need a big area to erase, pink school erasers are terrific. They sell the gummy erasers. Don't buy those when you're doing graphite drawing, please. Those are more for chalky substances to pick them off the paper and pull them away. They do not work that great, I found in my experience, on graphite. Stick to charcoal if you're going to get the sticky guys, okay? But for our purposes today, we're using these 2 tools. Are there other pencils out there? You bet your bottom dollar there are. There's tons of other pencils out there, okay? And we just have number 2 school pencils. They're a lead that is kind of versatile. It's not really super hard, and it's definitely not a soft lead, okay? And when you see the numbers on there, there's going to be a number that says HB2 on this one, okay? We're not too worried about that right now. We will get into shading pencils and graphite softness and hardness in the future. Graphite is what fills the inside of a pencil, okay? And it's that tool that we use to smudge and shade. Today we're just focusing on this. So looking at the sphere here, I'm not even going to look at the hand at the moment. I'll sketch it out in a minute to help you find it. But at the moment here, we're going to just kind of shade in. And all I'm doing is notice that you have an area that's real light, and it gets slightly dark, gets less dark again, gets a little darker, much darker, less dark, dark, okay? That's the general thing. And look at whatever happens here, this gradient from light to dark to light to dark, 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 light, blah, 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 going back and forth, happens over here as well, okay? It's just very nice and pronounced in our sphere. So going over here, going to use that, and I'm going to pretend that there is a directional light to help us out. And I'm going to pretend that my directional light is the same light that's coming from right there, like that. It's coming from up here. If it helps you, draw out a light bulb, okay? And you have to decide whether the light bulb is lined up directly with the sphere, so the sphere is here and the light bulb's right there, or if it comes this way or back. Okay? In our life right here, we're going to have a very identical light source like this one. Right up there, I pretend. Coming down like that. So I'm going to take my number 2 pencil and I'm going to copy what's going on here over to these different areas that say 1 to start out with. Okay, so 1 here, I'm going to gently start to shade this area in, like that. Going up here, I'm just making little lines. They don't have to go any particular direction right now. It doesn't really matter. You can even scribble if you need to. Scribbling is fine too. And remember, we're not trying to nail shading right now. What we're trying to do is we are trying to show how we map out these different shapes. And the reason that we're actually doing a tiny bit of shading is so that we can start to train our brain to identify those shapes when we start to see them. Okay, it doesn't look like a whole lot of anything right now, right? All it does is it looks like kind of some upside down rainbows. So that's good. We're going to move on to this one over here. This guy's doing the same thing. Remember that our light's coming from over there, so it's going to be a little dark just on the edge, and then it's going to come around like that, going up, making whichever scribbles you want, and that's going to get a little darker there again, going up. Then I have a number 1, another number 1 down here. Now this number 1 is a kind of a peekaboo one. So we're thinking this as like a shape right there. We won't see this area so much, so we're going to darken it out because these two guys are hiding it. They're hiding some of the light there, so we're not going to see that. We're not too worried about that right now. Like that. Kind of make it nice and dark there. Then we're going to use the same thing we have here, and we're going to shade it in. Like so. Moving on, we're going to look down here, and this one is not showing up on my copy, but I'm pretty sure that this was marked as a 1 as well. Let me check and see. Hold on. Looks like it was not marked. So I guess you can kind of identify what you want. So I'm going to go with 1 since I have chunky fingers, and if you have chubbier fingers, you're going to have more folds and more 1s in there, more spheres. Same thing going up in this area here where the skin folds over. You won't see as much light. Okay, going in there, down there as well. Darkening my area here like my sphere right there. This is where the light's coming from, that way. And then down here, this is probably going to be a cylinder, right? See how the shape of it, if I was to continue it and go down like that, it would be a cylinder. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to use the same thing. I'm going to turn it sideways like this, and I'm going to put in some dark light there. And I go over here, my cylinder kind of does one of these, like that, right? Put a little bit of dark in there. There you go. Moving down here, we have a 1. Same thing, whenever something's underneath another item like this, it can't get light there. But the pudgy little finger at the end there feels ball-like, so it's still going to catch some light. So I'm identifying those shapes, and very quickly you can even do something like this. Underneath there, won't see it as much. And remembering, we're not really going for a very hyper-realistic look right now. If you're looking at this and you're going, this isn't that great, or if you're looking at yours and going, this isn't that great, we're not really worried about mimicking reality exactly at the moment, okay? What we're worried about is starting to flesh out what this looks like, okay? So over here, going to a number 3. So turning it sideways this way, going underneath here, follow my cylinder rule, okay, like that, underneath here, like so. And I won't really see this area here because it goes up, remember? This little skin fold right there, I won't see it. The light's coming this way, and it's going to hit the fold, the part that comes out here. So think of it this way. I'm going to get my little cylinder sheet over here, and we're going to turn it sideways like this for a moment. Okay, turning it like this, right underneath, so you can see the cylinder shape right here. And I'll even turn it at the angle that we're doing. So see, cylinder, cylinder. Going through here, starting to darken that a little bit. Adding some little scribbles in so it matches the other ones. I made it a little dark over there, so I'm going to darken this guy. There you go. This is a number 3 as well. So that helps you turn your cylinder to look more like the shape that you have over here. Like so. I'm going to scoot this over just a little wee bit. Remembering that we have our major shapes that we're kind of orchestrating here and finding. Put this guy right there for a moment. Make sure you guys can see on the sheet. Perfect. So looking at our cylinder right there, like this, turning it at an angle that matches, and then doing the same thing. So it's a little curved on the side, but it's still more cylindrical. Coming down there. Not going to see this area here because the finger hides it. Same thing, finger hides underneath there. Finger hides under here. Darken that a little bit. Coming over here, starting to fill this in real quickly. Like so. This way over here. Coming up. And you're asking, why am I rounding this area out here? Well, when the skin folds, this area feels a little roundish. And if we look there, the top of it is just a little dark, right? But it can't see the light from our light source up there. So still sticking with the cylinder, getting kind of dark there. And notice how the cylinder dark line here kind of lines up with that one, and it gets a little lighter over there because there's a peekaboo of light. Okay, now we are going to put this aside for a second. And we're going to move on over to the number 1 over here, which is the shiny nail, okay? And the shiny nail is coming from an angle, same as before, right up here. So our brightest spot's going to be somewhere up there. So we're going to go like this. We're going to shade around the corner and get a little bit darker, just like our sphere. Come around here. And it's slightly flat, so it's not going to be super bright until we get to our highlight. Okay, the brightest part's called a highlight. Do you need to know that at the moment? No, you don't, but it helps you kind of flesh this out a little bit. And all we're trying to do is add a little bit of dimension and see in reality how we are mapping out our shapes, how they're related to the things that are around us in everyday life. Remember how I discussed earlier about organic shapes, right? These are our 3 mostly used organic shapes. We have our sphere, we have our cone, and we have our cylinder shapes. And then of course, don't forget we have our plane, which we're going to have some planes throughout here. And I'll explain that a little bit later. And remembering also, as you're drawing your own hand, your hand's going to be very different from mine. Drawing is about identifying what you see, and your eye might be different than my eye. As long as it translates to a hand, you're in good shape. Now the difference between your hand and my hand is in the shapes that is actually in them. And if you wanted to put your hands in a bunch of lineups of pictures and pick one out, you better draw your hand better than you would draw my hand, right? Like you're not sure what my hand looks like. Right now I'm drawing a generic hand. I'm just creating an outline and filling in the space with how a sphere works or how a cylinder or this cone. So over here I'm going to a sphere, or I'm sorry, a cylinder again. And I'm going to turn my cylinder like we did before at an angle that mimics right here. Going up there. Going over here. I do the same thing, continue this way, like that, slightly. And then I'm going to darken this area here. Going to darken this area here. Remember how we talked about at the end, this says 1 right there. Look at that. And it gets a little bit of a pinch there where your finger, the ball of your finger gets a little round, or sometimes got a little flat piece in it, but for mine it gets a little chunky there. I want to go up the side a little bit there because it folds up a little bit like that. Okay, and then up here we're going to just gently shade a little bit because it's still not the brightest part of our hand. A little bit there. Over here we're going to look at the 3. Remember how I said in the knuckle area, this area right here tends to be kind of ball, circular and round. So I'm going to kind of mentally add a little bit of a circle in there, but I'm just going to have it kind of overlaying a cylinder. So I'm going to start with my number 3. Start like this. Follow my number 3 rules. Still thinking about where my light is. Going back and forth like this. Back and forth like this. Gonna darken underneath here a little bit. And see how it feels real flat now? So I need to add in that kind of sphere that's there to acknowledge it a little bit. So I'm kind of mapping the shape of the circle a little bit. I'm scribbling back and forth. and I'll even add, look at that, a couple little lines up there. All right, so it's starting to wrinkle on me. Up here, if we look, this says 1. That's because that's where one of your other knuckles is, or bone, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to kind of sketch in a real loose sphere using the same thing here. I don't need it to be too dark, like that. And then this area here is kind of a plane, okay? So that means kind of a flat shape, like that. So we're going to kind of sketch that in a little bit. Okay, going over here, going to keep adding in a little bit of this knuckle shape that looks like a sphere. And you don't have to make it super dark. Remember, in areas where the light doesn't hit underneath, it's going to be darker, okay, where it gets less light. Remember the picture that I showed you earlier? There, okay. Paper keeps wrinkling. All right, so those are pretty good. We have one over here. We need to give him a little bit of a sphere shape. Round it out, round it. If you're not sure, how do I make a sphere? You could do one of these where you just go over and over again until it starts to build up. And as you get to the middle, get lighter. So I have a sphere there. I can do it right here too. Going up, going up, going up. Okay. And whoop, I'm dropping stuff like it's hot. Pushing this down here, and this whole area over here says a number 3, so it's cylindrical. And we still have this little fold here, and he's kind of a little plane, so he follows his own little rules. We have to look at light and see, and sometimes you just got to pay attention to planes. Those are flat surfaces, or surfaces that don't really fill in these other 3 areas that don't really work that well. Okay, and next what we're going to do here is we are going to look at that 3. We're going to turn it this way, which is our cylindrical shape, like this, following our rule for our light, right? And actually, it's more like this. So our light's kind of on that side. So going up here, like so, going through, and then at the bottom down here, going through, adding this in. Up, going up, following there, that it gets a little bit darker towards the top there, right where it meets the knuckle area a little bit, sketching across, looking down here, getting dark again, just like our cylinder. Look at that, it meets up with the cylinder that's over here. Notice how those type of things kind of work together. Okay. Once again, not worrying about shading, learning to identify those shapes. Learning to identify those shapes. Okay, now this is the part where you can start to blend those things together to make them lighter or darker. Okay, as I'm looking over here, I think this is a little bright right there, so I'm going to kind of erase a little bit of that area because I want the top of my hand to have a pop. Okay, and I'm going to very quickly start to darken some of those areas a little bit more, going in, just going over them, going through, and remembering that you won't see as much light in the ones in the middle back here as you will on the outside. So what I do is I lightly dust these areas so they feel like they push back. Okay, and then you can very gently along the edges, just like there's reflection there. You'll see it on the outside, but you won't see it so much. Ooh, I can't get in there at this angle as the ones in the middle. Okay, so going through, working that out a little bit, using this kind of sketch to come across here to build up these lines. Darkening back here, which is your farthest one. So all you do is you take what you already have and you just darken it a layer more. It means adding more to it, like this. Right, this was a sphere. Add a little bit more there. Same thing. This is a cylinder. Add a little bit more there. And if you want to, you can always get a little peekaboo that comes through here like this. You can always highlight it. You can use your finger to blend when you're first starting out like this to get those shapes kind of go together. Don't get in the habit of using that finger though. See, one thing gets dirty and the other thing is that it gets ingrained in your paper. So later on when you're going and you want to erase some shading you've done, it doesn't work so well. Okay, so what we did here is we went through and we identified our shapes. We made sure that they made sense, and then we drew our item. Okay, for this next part, what I want you to do now is you're going to actually sketch your own hand. I'm going to very quickly sketch one in front of you without all of the accoutrements of shading. We're simply going to look for boundaries. So boundaries are where shapes stop and become another thing. So the boundary between countries, the boundaries between states, okay, the boundaries of the different pieces of a puzzle, it is where one thing ends and another thing begins. So as an artist, sometimes it's difficult to discover where one thing begins and another thing ends when you have an organic shape like a hand where everything kind of melds together. So this activity, once again, doing a hand, is very good for that type of thing. So what I'm going to do here is in the bottom right hand corner, in this area down here, I am going to put a static picture of the hand that I'm going to be drawing. And you're just going to follow along with me at home and start to draw your hand using the shapes that we found, and they're identifiable 2D shapes, okay? So remember, you're looking for a sphere, you're looking for a cylinder, and you're looking for a cone, but you're going to put down a circle, you're going to put down a square or a kind of like rounded squarish shape or a rectangle, or you're going to put down kind of a triangular kind of shape. Now when I say these things, please remember that it's going to be blunted. Any of these shapes over here that has a little bit of a top to it, this kind of pointy shape is going to be blunted. So I'm taking my hand here, very gently I am looking at the shape that's down here, which is kind of a ball shape right there. Comes up here, looks like kind of a cylinder shape like this. This part here looks like kind of circular shape. And you'll see this a lot in all kinds of drawing. You'll see it in comic book and manga drawing or anime drawing, however you like to say it. Down here I have what looks like kind of a sphere at the end of my thumb. Got to elongate that a little bit. Comes down like that. There's some lines here that I'll have to take care of later. This is real important. This is the meat of my palm coming down here. And keep your lines sketchy and free at first. Do not firm up and make dark lines. On your initial worksheet that I gave you, there were some very firm lines there, but guess what? That's just to help you identify boundaries. Right now, we're kind of free-forming some boundaries. We're kind of starting to figure out where those things are. Also, don't be afraid to erase. I'm probably going to erase at some point up here too. Going up, and then finding this shape right here, right there is kind of a cylinder shape. So going up, kind of a cylinder there. This one comes out this way, kind of a cylinder shape that comes down. Actually, it's a little farther over than that, come to think of it. Sometimes you're going to misidentify stuff. Going over, it is still a cylinder shape. It's coming down, and it tucks underneath that way, like that. These lines are coming up here, going up more. I have some lines going here. I'm going to map those out, and they're going at an angle. And this looks kind of like, almost like a sphere down here too. The meat of my hand over there. It's up. And then this over here, I like to continue one after another. It helps with proportion and space. So looking over there. Then if I look here, this guy here, he looks like a cylinder. Cylinder. He's got a little kind of cylinder that goes down. Actually, it's more like a cone. The end of my finger there going downward. Same thing down here. This guy goes down. Looks like more of a cone there. Okay. I think I'm going to erase this little area here. Need to make this a little wobbly. making sure to change your shapes as you go through, like that. And you can always firm them up later on. Remember, this is kind of a discovery exercise. We're not really going for perfect. Real, very good, excellent, realistic drawing takes a lot of time to do because there's a lot of mapping and spatial comparison. Okay, so what you can do is you can find, if you're having trouble and you're drawing, you know, your thumb over here and you're drawing your finger way up here, something like that, what you need to do is you need to triangulate. Okay, so that just means taking 3 points of reference and kind of figuring how far apart they are. Okay, so for instance, a good way to do that is I'm going to look at the corner of my nail right here. So I'm going to mark that. I'm going to put my nail up here like that, just for now, kind of a junky nail. And then I'm going to map how far away the edge of my finger is up there. So that's pretty accurate. However, I'm looking here and this does not look that good now. So I use triangulation and I'm going to tighten up my shape there. It's still kind of a cylinder that has a little bit of a ball at the top, and I'm still going to go ahead and change that. So I'm going to go over like that. There we go. Ups down like this. That feels better. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly number these. 1, cylinder, 3. I'm going to call that a 1, a big 1 down there. They're 2 separate ones. I'm going to call this a 3 cylinder. I'm going to call this a 2, a cone. We haven't really used a lot of cones yet. I'm going to call this a 2, a cone as well. I'm going to call this a 1. This area right here kind of comes out. And then I'm going to call this here a 3. This right here is a cylinder. I'm going to call that a 3. This here, this area right here, there's a flat plane here. It's hard to see from your angle up there. I'm going to sketch it in there, and I'm going to call that number 4 plane. Okay, right there. And then over here, I'm going to call that a 3. And then I have a plane shape over here, which is a 4, 4, sphere, cylinder. Okay, so I'm going to put my light on it now, and my light's coming forward. So I'm going to put it up here like this, but I'm going to think in my mind it's a couple feet this way. So that means that way I don't have to hold my own hand all the time. And same thing for you. If you want to hold your hand, please do. It can be very helpful. So I'm looking at these. So now I'm going to use my rule, and I'm going to pretend like the light's coming from this way. Okay, instead, which means all my spheres, when I do my sphere and I transfer it to my cylinder or my cone, it is going to be more like this. Remember, we have to remember if there's something underneath that reflects light back up, okay? And then my brightest spot will be more towards the kind of middle top area like that. So it'll be something a little bit like that, a little bit different than this one right here, correct? Correct. All right, so very quickly, because I don't want this to be a 19-hour workshop, I feel like it's a lot of information to pack in one thing, but drawing is such an intensive study that if you can kind of connect all these dots that we talked about all at once, it's very helpful. And remember, when we're drawing lines, lines are important. They transfer information, right? So curved lines feel energetic. That's why your fingers feel like, ooh, when they have so much chunky lines in them that are curved. It's because they're organic. Their structure is meant for energy and movement and strength, okay? They don't look square. If they did, they would be very clunky, right? Click, 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 click. So number 3, I'm going to go up here. I'm going to think about my brightest spot. It's going to be right about there. I'm going to sketch that. Sketch my cylinder, looking over there. Cylinder, cylinder, cylinder. Still going to be a little dark on the top because we're using this. The light's a little to this side. Okay, there we go. This one's going to be a cylinder, same thing. Turning my cylinder sideways a little bit. Hold it this way. Going down here. Not going to see that very much, so I'm going to start with it kind of dark. Like that. Okay. Cylinder there. Over here, going to do cylinder. Cylinder here. And that dark over there. Dark over there. Dark over there. Then I'm going to move on to, it says 1, because this is kind of like a little bit of the knuckle area there. So I'm going to give it kind of a circle shape. Remember, the quickest way to shade a circle is to make a circle. Coming down to number 2, which is a cone shape, and this cone's upside down. So it's more like this, right? So looking at my cone shape, like that, comes up. And then I have my little nail down there, which you can't see because it's foreshortened. Got this little nail down there, same thing, it's foreshortened a little bit. It's got some weird squeezies going on. You got number 3. Which is a cylinder. Going down that way. It's a little bit darker, can't really see it. Up here you have a number 4, which is a plane. We didn't really talk about that, so it's kind of dark there. But this part here is a number 3. So going up, starting to treat this like a sphere, or I'm sorry, a cylinder there. Okay, still have the finger, whoops, I went up into my thumb there, my bad. I lost my boundary. There you go, that's a good example of boundary loss. Like so, right there. Going up. Coming down, looking at those lines just to kind of help me figure out where I'm at. I have the nail, which looked a little spherical. Still going to stick with that kind of thing. Putting our darkest in and paying attention to our light source up there that we kind of faked in. Okay, same thing with these guys down here. They're going to be kind of hard to see, but they'll still have a little bit of that going on. We have a number 4 over here, which is a plane, which means we pay careful attention to how it was. So if I bring it back up like this, I think that's about right. Yeah, right about there. I look and I see that there's some folds over there. So I draw those folds in. Now you can treat folds like spheres and things like that, but just for the sake of quickness, I'm going to go ahead and just sketch over them. I have a 1 over here, which is a sphere. So we want to go ahead and flesh that out like that. You can always erase and kind of gentle it up later on. That's what erasers are good for. You can always add highlights to it by erasing something. It's not always erasing a mistake. Sometimes it is adding in a thoughtful deduction. So down here is a 1. Shaping up like that. Looking at our shape of our sphere, and remembering that these shapes merge with other stuff. So this is a cylinder down here. Looking at our cylinder shape. Looking at our cylinder shape down here. That turns into also another 1. And here it's dark as heck. Hard to see what's going on in there. Just gonna kind of sketch in some dark there. Darken it up. Got the edge there. And if you really want to make your artwork, if it's dark on the edge, appear realistic, whatever you're doing, if you're learning to sketch, darken out the world around it a little bit. So you remind yourself there's no reflective quality of something next to it, because everything in life that you see is a mirror, which is like, whoa, that's so deep. But no, not really. It's just science. So anything that has reflective properties is something we can see with our eyes. And if there's nothing to reflect over here, then this area actually would be really dark in real life. Everything close to the boundaries of the edge. So our boundary, our real life boundary, okay? Or we talked about that before. We created these different shapes here based on what we observed, but our boundary, if you were going to, from one thing to the next, these are kind of the hard boundaries. And the boundaries are those things that we identify where one thing begins and another thing ends. And sometimes people have a hard time with that. Sometimes they are so good at it, they have a hard time identifying the things going on in the inside. So remember that boundaries are created by things that we relate to one another. So context, okay? Context is important in art, not because of just telling a message, but because you're creating a relationship between something. So this shape that goes up here, we bring it up there, it looks a lot like kind of a curvy V, right? So remember, you can draw the outside, the negative space of something, as well as the positive. So the shapes that go on inside, like the whole thing, this whole item here is called a positive shape or positive form or positive space, okay? If it's in 3D, if it's in real life, it's called form, but here it's a positive space, okay? And this is the negative space where there's the empty, there's nothing. But this is what we are going to talk about. Just the teeniest bit we'll touch on, and we're almost done here, is that in order to see what is, you have to kind of see what isn't. Your brain has to find what the empty shape is, okay? It's like a puzzle piece. So let's do this exercise here. If I had to fit a shape in this spot right here, it would be this one. So when your brain is making shapes and it's figure things out from one shape to the next, sometimes you can use an uncompleted shape. Like this guy wouldn't have a top on it, and you would start to draw him right here. Okay, so negative shapes and positive spaces, these two things that are going on, are very helpful in drawing. Okay, so remembering that boundaries are important, quick sketching is important, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Okay, I'm an art teacher. This isn't a beautiful piece of art right here, but it is a quick, fun study practice with you. Okay, you got to give yourself a little bit of credit as a beginner, somebody who's just starting out. Try not to get frustrated. Just think of the shapes. Okay, and if you're finding a hand difficult, switch to something else. That's okay too. You can study other things. And if you're feeling particularly saucy, you can even work on something mechanical looking. Sometimes that's easier for people to start out with. If you're somebody who is mechanically inclined, drawing a piece of equipment might be easier for you. Drawing an engine block or a piece of an engine or some gears, things that have angles in them, might be easy for you, okay? So don't get frustrated. You're doing a great job out there. I know you are. You're doing a good job. Keep up the good work. And if you have questions or comments, go ahead and let us know. And don't forget, you can always contact us at our contact information, and I'll be more than glad to try to answer any questions you have.